Okay, so we're recording now. Yeah, and I told you, Kyle, I was going to ask you to repeat something you just said.
Yeah. So we were talking about cognitive insight flow or dialogos, I think is what you said, right?
Hmm.
Um, and just how it can be very difficult to understand what someone's saying. And I recently took a class for a degree that I'm getting in education, primarily about communication. And the interesting thing to me, the thing that really stood out was communication can break down with the first person that's just speaking because there's what someone wants to convey. So if I'm trying to convey a thought, the moment that I start using language to explain that to someone, I might not be using the correct words, if that makes sense. So I could, yeah, I could just be using the wrong words. So the communication breakdown can start with the very first person before anyone else even gets involved. And then the other person hears what they're saying, and they might have a different understanding of certain words, or the cadence might be a little too fast or a little too slow. Different things can make them interpret or receive that information differently than the person intended to send it. And then they actually need to process that. And it like there's multiple ways that it can break down communication wise, I suppose.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And if I could just maybe connect that to another sort of thing about dialogos, it seems a technique people use often is, um, or it's almost more of a frame of understanding how to handle that miscommunication. So, like, if I have a thought, I'm going to kind of stumble around, and it's not going to be as perfect as if I sat down to write something and worked on it for a long time. It's going to be a bit of a meandering path. But if I can trust that the listeners are listening fully, what they'll do is they'll kind of hold that thought in their head, and they'll actually take the signal out of the noise. So if I say something that's only like 5% signal, and all that the listener does is then go, oh, okay, well, what I heard was this, and they take the signal and amplify it. We can actually collectively amplify the signal in a way that's well, a lot more rapid than anything you can do just by yourself or just by writing, because you can another. And I think I said this just before we started recording. In the right conversations, I can be completely immersed in speaking, not even listening to myself, because I know I've learned that you two in this case are fully listening, and then I can end. I don't know what I've just said exactly, and then I can count on you to reflect it back.
Yeah. One thing I wanted to add to what Kyle was talking about is on the first person speaking, and Kyle, you touched on this before we were recording, that is the inflection,
Yeah.
and especially with different languages, or if English is not your first language, your your first language pattern and rhythm and rhyme and all that stuff can convey unintended meaning. And so I just wanted to add that little piece. Yeah, it's multi layers, and where there's all kinds of opportunity for a signal to get kind of jumbled up. And um, if you could imagine having a picture of a chair in your mind, but you cannot use the word chair, and how to describe that and get the same picture to occur in somebody else's mind, you would end up with a pretty bizarre contraption, you know.
Yeah.
And there's, anyway, that's just it. So,
Yeah.
Yeah.
what else, man? Yeah.
One interesting thing I've for anyone not working, I know that both of you know this, but I've spent 6 years collectively just over in call centers and across two different call centers. And one thing that both call centers did was they would kind of give you an example of how hard it can be to communicate something that's fairly complex or very detailed. They would give one person a sheet of paper with different shapes on it, like a collection of triangles or squares or rectangles and sometimes lines and dots and things like that. Um, and you would hide it from the other person, and you would just have to describe to them without pointing or anything, just this is what it is. So you'd say, okay, on the bottom half of the page, if you were to fold the page into thirds or something like that, or starting from the exact center, we're going to draw a equilateral triangle with the left bottom point, the triangle's facing up on that center, and each side is an inch long. It's like, well, even with all of that very detailed description, someone might not know what an equilateral triangle is. They might
Yeah.
misunderstand what the left point is. They might think something entirely different. Who knows? It can break down so quick when you're trying to describe something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In call center work, you can't show them anything. It's just the voice over the phone, and that's
Yeah.
it.
Yep.
That's a real weak signal,
Yeah, it is. It can be real tough, real tough. Part of what I did, I know you both know this, but for those not aware, is insurance. So trying to explain even something fairly simple to me, at least. It's simple and makes total sense to me. Bodily injury and property damage liability can be pretty tough for someone that doesn't understand how liability works, or
Yeah.
they don't understand the difference between bodily injury and property damage. It can be real a challenge to explain something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Brand new
it's like,
driver, or maybe a brand new business owner. Now he's into the
Yep.
business class of insurance. Holy cow! I thought I knew. Now I don't know.
Yeah.
in a way, communication is always a miracle when it actually seems to occur halfway successfully. It's a bit of a miracle that we can take a thought, as you were saying, Kyle, earlier, take a thought, force it into language, speak it out into sound waves, and then it's downloaded, and it's pretty phenomenal.
Yeah.
Um,
Especially when you take
ability.
all of the other evolutionary aspects of communication out, when it's just language, when you don't get to, I think the most basic form is through written language, because listening to someone talk, you can hear all the inflection, like you were talking about, Dad. But when you start to try and write out a thought or something like that, it can be really, really difficult because they don't understand where the emphasis is or the inflection.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Just as a little experiment on that, if you take a little simple sentence fiber, 6 words long, and then just play with it and emphasize the first word, the second word, the third word by
Yeah.
itself, and see how that changes the whole meaning of the conversation,
Yeah.
And
Mm-hmm.
yeah, and then you boil that down to little squiggly black marks on white paper. Man, that's a
Yeah.
weak signal. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'd like to add in something here. So, your example, Kyle, of the paper of shapes that you're trying to describe to somebody else, that's hard enough. And what we're actually, well, part of what we wanted to talk about today is sort of the importance of having deep conversations today. And what we're talking, what we all want to talk about today, I mean, I don't mean us here right now, but in general, the things we need to talk about are way, way more, less straightforward than a sheet of shapes.
Yeah.
And I think there's a good and a bad side to it. The bad side, of course, is that it's like, wow, that makes it even more hopeless. Like, geez, for me to explain the how my thoughts have now sort of settled in regards to coronavirus and lockdown, especially to somebody who has pretty opposite beliefs. Wow, that's quite a task. But I think the positive is that there's something about, if I am looking at the world and I form some opinion about it, and then I speak to you about it, you're going to be connecting what I say to what you know of the world. And so in the very act of listening, you're kind of synthesizing what I've seen with what you've seen. And we get almost like a parallax vision effect, where like my two eyes together are positioned differently. And that different positioning is actually what enables me to see depth perception. It's not that the right eye or the left eye is right. It's not like one eye is off of the other and wrong. And in a similar way, when you can converse deeply with somebody, even the miscommunication is a kind of parallax. It's a kind of deepening of the experience.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Because it relates uniquely to each person's environment.
yeah, exactly. Each person is positioned differently. I mean, not only you could imagine physically positioned differently, but just I guess I mean more frame of view or ideologically positioned differently.
Yeah. One thing that I've when I was doing observation hours for my education degree, I was trying to help a student understand how to basically proceed with a question. Like, he had all of the information he needed, but he didn't know, a lot of times for math, they'll give someone 5 pieces of information and say, give me 1. And really you just need 2 pieces of information to get to the 1 piece of information you need. So some of it is just kind of, it's relevant information, but it's not as relevant as the 2 pieces of information that you need. So what I told them is, to get any piece of more detailed information, especially with mathematics, but for really anything, but specifically for mathematics, you need 2 pieces of information. That's it. You might need to use 2 pieces of information to generate another piece of information, and then use one of the old pieces and your new piece to get to where you need to go. But you always need 2 pieces to get to what you need. So if you know what you need, those 2 pieces, you can figure out what they are and then get to that one. And I think it's kind of parallel to what you were talking about. You need 2 perspectives to see depth.
Yeah.
If you're given a painting, you might have a good idea based on some of the information there, but you don't know. exactly how far away it is until you have 2 points of perspective.
Right. Right. Well, and I think the key is to get to new information. So you could have one data
Yeah.
point. That's fine. It's all fine, you know, whatever. But if you
Mhm.
want to get a new data point, it's like you need to bring in something else. And maybe that's just internally, personally, you know, maybe I'm trying to solve some computer programming problem that I need to sort of massage my own thoughts to get there. But maybe a very rich way of doing it, especially when we're talking about making sense of the world today. Um, uh, if you bring in another person and if they're a good combination of dissimilar viewpoints but common language, and then there's also the other things like psychological safety, all the things we need to have deep conversations, then you can so rapidly get new information. And it's not even a compromise too. I think a lot of people think in terms of it's easy to think of two people with opposing viewpoints as the goal is let's find the truth and both move to the truth, or the goal is let's compromise. But I think there's a much richer style of conversation where you can compare and contrast, and suddenly you're not exactly even on the same plane anymore. You found a different dimension, a better view that contained both of the lower dimensional views. It's like if you look at a 3D cylinder, but if you look at it two-dimensional, from one view it's a circle, and from another view it's a rectangle. And if you have one person saying it's a circle, another person saying it's a rectangle, those appear to be completely irreconcilable. But if you add the third dimension the third dimension there, literal third dimension, then you have the full picture that allows for both of the apparent contradictions.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the cylinder was a great example. I've run across that before, and I think that's a great.
Yeah. Or like the blind man and the elephant, a similar thing.
Oh,
Yeah.
touching one spot on the elephant, you can't get the whole. Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So Kyle, you and I emailed a little bit, and we seem to agree that there's like not just a need for deep conversations, but like a pressing need today specifically. Am I getting that right?
I think so. Yeah. I think that even if you take two incredibly dissimilar people, two very, very different viewpoints, either politically or religiously, or, two people that are very different in as different of a way as you can possibly conceive, there is common ground. There's always going to be common ground. I, as a human, enjoy breathing, and I like drinking water, and I enjoy getting food, nutrients in some form or fashion. And that's like really, really basic, kind of just human level. But even if you expand that to politically, there's a lot that even the most dissimilar political people could most often agree on. And a lot of them are very basic issues, and you're not going to debate a lot of those basic issues. But I think that if conversations started in a way where, two people on gun control, I think is a really good example. One person wants a lot of really, really strict gun laws to impose restrictions or ban firearms entirely in America. When you're pitting them against someone who wants almost no regulation, and they think that everyone should be able to police themselves, if you boil it down to what each person wants, it's the same thing. They both want safety. They both want less gun deaths as far as people go. So if you go, okay, we both agree that we want less gun deaths, but we disagree on how. But I really want to focus on what we agree on first. And I want to focus on some of like just the raw data without, pulling truth from where it is not. Because some people say, there's a lot of gun regulation in Chicago, but that's one of the highest gun death rates in the country. And it's like, well, people just bring it from overstate. So let's not get to that point right away. Let's just say there are gun deaths in Chicago. The number of gun deaths in Chicago is staggering. How do we reduce that? We both want it lower, right? We can agree that we want it lower. Let's talk about some of the merits and the flaws of either solution in a real way. Because if we just say there are no guns in Chicago and that we just can snap our fingers and they all disappear, people are still going to die. There's still going to be violence. People will just use bats or knives. And if we snapped our fingers and said, now everyone in Chicago has a gun, I don't think that solves the issue either. So there's a middle ground here. You know what I mean?
Mm.
I think that we should focus on what is the problem. Should we solve, like, I don't know if I'm saying this well. Basically, we can agree there's a problem. We both agree that we want it solved, but we disagree on how. But let's focus on what the problem is and where we would want to see it go.
Mm.
Let's think of, like, if there were, a perfect system, we would want no violent deaths in Chicago. Yeah, I think most people would agree on that we don't want violent deaths, but we disagree on how. But let's focus on what we agree on first,
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
almost get that psychological safety that you were talking
Yep.
about.
Yep.
Like, okay, we both don't want people to die, because I think that sometimes conversations do get to that point. Like, there are people that are pro-choice and pro-life, and very often you'll hear someone on either side of that conversation say, well, you must hate women. No, I
Right.
don't think that's the case. I really, really don't. I think that we both want, a solution here, but we disagree on the method.
Yeah. Let me jump in there a little bit, and it's on the point of, I think, finding common ground, which is, I think, a missing ingredient in a lot of conversations. They just enter into it, and the first words out of their mouth are, "I'm against you," or "your idea," or whatever.
Mhm.
And I think, that especially like let's take gun control as an example. And I think, like you said, Kyle, both people on both sides of the argument could have a lot of common ground. They both want their kids to be safe. Neither one
Yeah.
of them want their kids shot, either from a stray bullet or an unlocked firearm in the house, or any of the. They all want their kids to be safe. Uh, Both of them probably don't want to be overrun by a tyrannical government. Okay,
Mm.
they could probably agree on that. Now, how do you get there? Well, okay, now we have some discussion and differences of opinions, but I think it would be helpful in a lot of these politically charged conversations to start with saying, hey, we're both humans. We both have a desire to breathe clean air, drink clean water, have good, nutritious food. We want our kids to be safe, and some common ground, things like that. And then, get closer and closer to the issue. And then at some point, then you can say, oh, I'm on one side and you're on the other.
Mm.
Yeah.
So that common ground, I think, is very important and really missing from a lot of important conversations today.
Yeah, and I would say a next a next step after getting that common ground is to, at least for the, and I don't know if this is, I don't know how universal this suggestion really is, but at least for the kinds of conversations I'm finding a lot of value in, if you can have everyone that is coming in sort of decide to leave the question open and not assume that I have the answer. So of course we all have our opinions going into, maybe especially like something like gun control. I could list off my opinion about gun
Yeah.
control easy.
Mhm.
But at this point, I've learned that if I really want to have a generative conversation, something that actually generates these insights reliably, then I really need to just sort of put that whole thing aside, start from common ground, and then be with the person questioning it. And if we can stay together questioning it and actually begin to step forward and say, oh, well, if that's true, then this must be true. Oh, yeah. And remain in this cooperative spirit, that seems like that's where the real insights can be found. Um, and also, it's not that hard once you get going. I think it's because it really feels really good.
Yeah.
When you're with somebody new, and you maybe in the beginning you sort of saw them as, okay, so like I'm pro, I think there should be less gun control, and if I'm talking to somebody who thinks there's more gun control, I'm going to see them, I'm going to sort of project onto them all these qualities. But if I can approach the conversation correctly, suddenly their insight and their beauty really starts to shine through to me. They're saying things I didn't expect. Suddenly I'm saying something and they're like, I was just thinking that. And they say something and I get goosebumps because it was so beautiful.
Yeah.
So, it seems like, it seems like these sorts of really deep, good conversations are like almost the whole key to a lot of what we're dealing with. I mean, I don't know, does that seem like an overstatement to you guys?
Well, I think that you're right on the target, and let me say it a different way. What we're bombarded with is the screamers from both extremes, shouting over the chasm at each other, you know, us normal people are stuck in the middle saying, gee, can I get a word in edgewise somewhere, you know? And I I'm not a fan of like the cancel culture, but I do see the wisdom in saying, okay, you know, you metaphorical conversation suicide bombers, you're not allowed in, you know.
Mm.
We're going to put up a gate here, and we're trying to have a meaningful conversation to come to some kind of a better understanding on a hot topic issue. And if you're going to come in here and scream insults at the other side, you're not welcome. And
Mhm.
Yeah.
and so uh, I think, you know, I'm not a fan of censorship as a writer. Oh my God, that's a hot topic for me. But and I'm not a fan of cancel culture. If you make one mistake in your history 20 years ago, all of a sudden you're deplatformed. I'm not a fan of that either. But you know, if you're just a metaphorical suicide bomber, you just want to blow shit up and derail conversations, dominate, kind of scream, and yet, no, I'm sorry,
Mm.
out you go. I think that's perfectly fine.
I'd,
Yeah.
I'd, I'd love to bring in something that you were talking about, Kyle, in one of our emails about you. We started talking about the conversation at the table, and you said something that I liked, which was you brought in the idea of the owner of the table, and the owner of the table has the right, or maybe even the responsibility, to sort of set the rules and say who is and isn't allowed. And
Yeah.
and part of what I'm doing, by the way, just to sort of speak out loud about how I try to do these conversations, I'm trying to put you in a place where you'll have to think aloud and explore, because that's exciting to me. So
Mhm.
like, if I could just ask you, if you, to the extent that you're the owner of a table at which there's a conversation,
Yeah.
what would you, how would you guarantee or best set the table for a deep generative conversation?
Yeah. Um, I think that it's it's like, sorry, I'm trying to like put it to words. Um, it's corny, but it's like that whole thing with great power comes great responsibility. If you are the owner of a platform that can have that, if you're the owner and regulator of a platform where genuine discussion could happen, but there are those within that community who are prohibiting that genuine discussion from happening, regardless of what their views are, I think that you should, uh, in a way, try and step in and say, look, this is not the type of discussion that we want to have, and we should all take a step back. If you are here to prove your point and not listen to others, you're not going to be part of a genuine discussion. And I would like you to stay at this table, but if you can't stay at this table, I will close the door on you.
Mm.
I just won't let you in. And it's really, really hard to have like a terms of service. Like, you know, a lot of social media outlets run into this problem a lot, where Twitter or YouTube or Facebook have terms of service, but they're imposed differently on different people, because one person says a sexist comment and they're fine and they don't get deregulated, and their videos don't get demonetized and stuff like that. And then someone else says a very, very similar statement, but they have a larger audience, or they have a smaller audience, or they're part of a minority, or they're not part of a minority, and they don't get demonetized. It's really, really tough to kind of have that whole thing. um, I think that without a individual track record to base like deregulating, or I'm sorry, demonetizing someone on, I don't think that it should be done unless someone says something incredibly egregious. um, I think that they should be issued warnings before they're just straight demonetized, because a lot of YouTubers, from what I watch, have been making a living off of this, and they don't change their content, and they're sometimes very politically charged or culturally charged, and then overnight all of their videos get demonetized, and they're not sure as to why. And I think there should be warnings issued, or at least a conversation, or somehow for them to say why. And it very rarely comes about that they actually discover why videos got demonetized, or things like that. Does that answer your question? Or
A little bit. I was actually more curious. Well, I'll ask it again, but first I just want to respond to what you did
yeah,
say, because it was
yeah,
interesting. Um, um, I guess I just want to say, yeah, these social media giants, and the keyword giant actually is,
hmm
I'll get back to that. Um, they have such a gargantuan, they have an impossible task, like to be responsible. Here's the thing, and this actually gets to sort of maybe the question I wanted to ask you more. The table is so big, it's not a table anymore, it's a platform. And like to say like we're going to stop all hate speech, which by the way is already subjective, but even to say we're going to stop all things that aren't true, again, back to subjectivity, we know today it's not, there's no mechanical way to say this or isn't, or this is or isn't true. I mean, to me, and this gets back to this, what I'm trying to do with this community, this, you know, in my small hub of the authentic relating community, is it seems like the only solution is to stop going to the huge platforms and find small people you can trust and talk to them. And that's how you make sense of the world. So now if I can maybe re-ask the question, if you are the owner of like a small table, like almost more like an actual kitchen table in your house, what, but maybe it's a table that sort of anyone can kind of show up at, because then you need rules. I mean, if it's people you trust, it's almost not a problem.
Yeah.
What then would you, does anything come to mind for like what?
Yeah, I think it, because I've experienced this a little bit just playing D&D, which I think is a pretty good analogy, because it's actually inviting people into a physical home and playing an actual game where you're sitting there with, you know, sometimes 6 other people.
For a long time too.
Yeah, for a long time. A lot of games can last, you know, 3 or 4 hours. And in that way, it's, you know, if you show up to that table and someone is making it not fun, I think that the first thing to do, and this is something that you see on D&D kind of advice subreddits all the time, just talk with them and say, look, when we play this game, we're doing it for this reason. And I think that that's also a good thing to establish when you're having deep conversations like this, is why are we talking about this? Because sometimes on talk show, you know, on talk shows, they'll invite someone on that has a very different opinion. And I think the genuine reason they do that is to get views, because the 2 people are going to get angry at each other, and that's what's going to happen. They're just going to be mad, and a lot of people are going to watch it. So if I were running a D&D table and I had someone come and they were very disruptive and they weren't fun to play with, I would honestly pull them aside after a session, and, or if it's, you know, most often it would be after a session, and say, hey, when we play D&D, we're doing it to have fun. We, you know, are doing it for this. We like to do this in the game and this, because there's multiple things you can do in a game like D&D. It's very, very deep. And if they're only focused on some aspect of the game that we're just not interested in, and it could be that they're not incredibly disruptive, but they're just not doing the same things that we're doing, just have a conversation with them and say, you know, when we play, we're really focused on just combat. We don't really care about role play. We don't really care about destination. We don't really care about the quest. Really, we're just trying to kill things. And when we're all anxious to get to fighting, and you want to talk to the barmaid about their crop, or the angry customer that came in 2 weeks ago, we don't care. And it's not that you're doing it wrong, but we just don't care. We just want to fight stuff. Now, if it's something that's, and like I said, that would be a conversation to have after the game is already done. And, you know, not everyone had a great deal of fun, but you can still have fun. You know, stepping out of your wheelhouse every once in a while can be a good thing to do, but not week after week after week. If it's something egregious, I would, you know, stop the game mid game and say, look, that's not what we're doing. You know, if someone starts, you know, in the game, like sexually assaulting a NPC or a non-player character, it's like, whoa, we don't know. We're not gonna let you do that here. And some people play D&D to almost live in that fantasy world, and it's too dark for a lot of people. And they're like, I don't want to do that. And that would be something I would stop mid-conversation for. And the same thing if it's a conversation. You know, if someone really wants to dig down into the details of something, and that's, or take it into a topic that we don't normally talk about, or we didn't sign up to talk about, but it's a fine topic to talk about, yeah, let's let them talk about it. But the moment someone starts getting angry or yelling, you can kind of put the brakes on and go, okay, wait, we're trying to have conversations here, not generate clickbait. So we're going to pause the conversation. We'll be back in 5 minutes if it's a live broadcast or something. Go to a commercial break and like take a step back and go, if this is what you're here for, you're not going to be here for much longer. We will remove you. And we'd like to have a conversation, but if you don't want to have a conversation and you want to be upset and prove a point, then we're not going to have you here. And that's kind of how I would regulate it, on a case-by-case basis. And it is very hard when you're looking at media giants. You're giving them an impossible task when, I don't know what the exact number is, but like 10 minutes of video content are uploaded to YouTube every 1 minute. You can't keep up with that. And a lot of it is, a 24-hour cycle of some song no one cares about. And it's like, okay, I'm not going to sit here and watch 24 hours of annoying content to make sure there's no anti-Semitic comments or like propaganda like on the 37.5-minute mark. Like I'm not going to, like it's impossible to do. So I think that, like you said, kind of avoiding those giants and keeping it small is a really good way to go. And also just having an open dialogue with the actual contributors to a community, checking in with players, going back to the D&D thing and saying, hey, did you guys have fun? Because one of the things that I like doing is trying out different rules for different stuff of D&D. And sometimes that makes the game a little harder or a little easier. But after a couple times of doing it, I'll go, hey, do you guys like this? Is this something that you want to keep doing? And if the consensus is no, then we should not do it anymore. And I've had to make that decision before because I've had rules that I thought were really, really cool and I actually really enjoyed that made the game more difficult. But in talking with players, they said it kind of took the fun aspect of it out for us because it was basically limiting their resources more, which made their use of them more impactful, but it made them not use them as much. So it was like, if you were given 10 uses of an item, you would use it a lot. Probably 6 or 7 times, and you might actually run out at the end of it. But if I only gave you one use of it, you would probably never use it because you're waiting for the perfect time to use it.
Right. So it seems like one more sort of summary or like common thread is like an awareness and like being present with the game and being okay with ready to point out when things aren't going right and correct it. And it's hard to do that, especially in a small circle. Yeah.
And just having intent behind things. And sometimes you can kind of go off the rails and not really have a point to it. And when someone points that out to you, I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing. If you realize you've been rambling and then someone says, okay, I think we kind of got your point, you can, oh, okay, yeah, I guess I was rambling. I'll take a step back. So just having intent about conversations and actions, and I think is the biggest thing, and not having a fear of being wrong, because you can't learn if you're afraid of being wrong. So.
So it's almost like having intent, but not so much locked into the intent that everything outside of the bounds of, like, you don't want to be so locked into your intent that any deviation is a transgression.
Yeah, exactly. And one of the things that I'll tell people when I'm playing D&D is, we're all here to have fun, and that can mean different things to different people, but that's the intent. We all want to have fun. And if, I try not to position it this way, but the reality is if one person is having fun and a lot of fun and they're really, really enjoying it, but the other 5 people at the table are just not because of that one person, I'm sorry, you might not be able to play anymore. I know that you had a great time, but we invited you in, you enjoyed it, but you changed the dynamic so much that we're not having fun anymore. So we're going to ask you to step away. And it's not that they're doing it wrong again. And I think that that's one thing where when people are excluded or not given a chance to do something, I think that they believe that the other party thinks they were wrong. That was kind of a long thing. So yeah, if I were to be excluded from a group, it's not because I am a bad person or wrong, or it's not because they don't like me. They could really enjoy me being around, but not for this specific thing. And I think that being excluded from something or asking to leave from something does not mean that you're bad or wrong in any way. And I think that that's a hard thing to believe, because it's easy to think I must have done something wrong. No, not really. You didn't do anything wrong. You just didn't bring enough benefit for us to invite you back.
Yeah, like
and that's a hard thing to kind of swallow and take in and not have it taste like poison, but it's a fact, I think.
Yeah. or like you could say there wasn't enough alignment, would be a pretty neutral way of putting it.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah.
I can jump in a little bit with maybe back to your question, Logan, of how do you create an environment for genuine conversation? If I can kind of go back to that point. And so my experience would be, I don't want to name the company, but it was a big company that I was working at as a technical writer. And both you guys know what that is. Anyway, the job was to bring a total quality management philosophy and program onto the company. And the company was, its history was really running, loose without a bunch of regular regulations or policies, and they were kind of called cowboys in that they could, just do what they wanted to do, and so on. So there was a lot of resistance to this effort, and so I was in the position of facilitating a meeting between, uh, on one side was a group of writers that were trying to create this new program, and all in the same room, and another group of people, and they were the managers of different departments of this company. So, the tension was high. There was one side wanted to do it, and the other side didn't want anything to do with it. And how do we come to, how do we get through the day? And so there were two things that were, I think, critical to those meetings being productive. One was an agenda that was published ahead of time. So you get your agenda 2 or 3 days ahead of time, and say that, here's the people that are going to be in the meeting, and here's what we're going to try to discuss. So that was a big part. And then the other thing was what we call ground rules for the meeting, and they were always, went over before the meeting, and always at the very top, no personal attacks. Okay, so I think, we're here to discuss the ideas, not the person. And so, then was a bunch of other ground rules, no interrupting and things like that. And so I think those two things, a stated agenda and ground rules for just conducting a decent conversation. And I think those things went, I think they worked really well in that everybody, understood, okay, no personal attacks, good, that's good. We can all agree to that, but in the heat of the moment, you might call somebody stupid. Well, don't do that,
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, that's my 2 cents on that. Just, agenda and ground rules. Yeah.
It's interesting. I feel some resistance to agenda, because like I'm all about lately like sitting down in a conversation, having no plan at all, and letting it go where it wants, and to me that leads to some great places. Although at the same time, I don't know if I've ever really tried to have a chat without some, at least a prompt, and then I guess I'm just thinking aloud here, but I think the only way you could get away with having a meeting without an agenda is if the people knew each other very well and were actually just looking forward to the conversation itself and the unfolding of it, which is sometimes the case in this community I'm involved in. But and I guess for the rest of it, I would just generalize it to culture, like a shared, understood culture. So you said ground rules, and I think that's one example of a culture you could have. Ground rules being maybe more of a deliberate, planned, sort of almost scientific, I want to say, or objective territory that people can navigate around. But I would say that that's just a specific instance of culture. You have to have a culture that people can lean on and understand and be able to predict, and they know what they're going to get into when they enter the meeting.
Yeah, that culture that you're talking about, I think just kind of defines the environment, the space, yeah, and what you're, kind of I guess it is ground rules without using that word,
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
And then, on your point of having a conversation without an agenda, I think a perfect example of that is just calling somebody, hey, let's go have a beer. Boom,
Mm-hmm.
no agenda. Yeah. We're just going to get together and talk because we like each other's thoughts, and that can be we have no idea where the conversation is going and no interest in determining that. We just want to talk, and just for the spontaneity, the fun, the jokes, the humor, and you can't have an agenda for any of that.
Yeah.
So there are those conversations where no agenda, out the door. We don't need a stinking agenda here.
Mm-hmm.
Well, maybe the difference there is the level of trust, or the level of yeah, a level of trust. I mean, you know, any one of us, I actually didn't say this in the beginning of the video, Kyle's my brother, and then this is our dad. And so any of us, if we just said, if my dad suddenly teleported here, and well, first of all, it'd be weirded out because that doesn't usually happen. But if, you know, if we were suddenly together, we wouldn't need an agenda because there's so much trust, and the conversation would just naturally emerge. But then I guess I just thinking aloud, if you go on a first date with somebody, there's not a lot of trust, and yet you don't need an agenda. But I guess what you have is you have a shared expectation of like some sort of fun. And there's also a shared context. So what are you doing? Are you at a coffee shop? Are you walking through an art exhibit?
Yeah.
I
And
don't
I
really know
think
where to.
that I think that there almost is a social agenda for something like a first date when there is almost no trust. Um, because, you know, there are certain things that are very okay to do on a first date, and other things that are, you know, not very common, and I would say not okay to do on a first date. Like a very bad first date would be, let's go meet my parents. And I think a pretty good first date would be, let's go get coffee. And you kind of understand the format of how that's probably going to play out. And if you're surprised by that, it could be a good surprise or a bad surprise. But I think that even like if any of us two were to have a conversation, there is like almost a social agenda. It's not really spoken, but you know, go out and grab a beer. The agenda is just a beer and talk, and that's it. You know, if you went out and had a beer, if you invited someone out for a beer, and then wanted to go to an art exhibit, it would be like, oh, that's kind of weird. But maybe between those people, it's totally fine. But maybe between those people, it's, I don't want to go to an art exhibit. I wanted to have a beer and sit down and talk. You know, there's almost an expected agenda, even if it's not expressly
Right.
laid out, I suppose.
Yeah, I would say in some cases, instead of the word agenda, just objective. So like on a
Yeah.
first date, the objective would be a second date, or, you know, some sort of, you know, we agreed to this first date because we want to go to some destination of a second date, or, you know, maybe there's a concert coming up. We're doing a first date to see if we can stand with each other to go to the concert, or, you know, something like that. But
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, of course, and the implied objective is always, you could either say the objective is to have a relationship or to see if the relationship works. Those are both objectives too.
yeah,
Or context is another word you could use in a similar way. It's a shared context. If two people try to have that's actually interesting. If two people try to have a conversation and they have different expected contexts, that's like a recipe for disaster. You know, I mean, I actually think about if one person thinks it's a date and the other person thinks it's like maybe a work
The
errand.
cup of coffee. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Well, yeah, and to the degree that they differ, you're playing with fire.
Yeah.
yeah, even the term "going to get a cup of coffee," that, and to some people, that's a really loaded statement that means way more than coffee.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
I got into that a couple times, and I didn't know the other meaning. I just said, "Let's go get a cup of coffee," and I got a really weird look from the other person, like, we're nowhere near that conversation yet." I'm like, "What? It's just a cup of coffee, you know." But
Yeah. Hmm. There's a term, you know, traveling around, the term hookup. Sometimes people mean that just to say, let's meet up later. Let's hook up later. But there's almost like a fun in the phrasing because it has this clear double meaning. And yet
yeah,
I can say, oh, let's hook up later. And then just act like it's, you know, casual, but the double meaning is sort of there in the air. It's kind of a fun thing. I guess in that case,
definitely.
there's it's not a, it's like there's an implied shared context of we're not sure what the context is almost.
Yeah.
Well, we can end it here, or what do you guys? I mean, let me actually ask a different question. How do you guys feel right now, or either one of you?
I'm good to go. I would almost sort of say, let's each take a little bit of turn of saying where we think our society, or global or local, and anywhere along that spectrum, where do we think our societies need to have some conversations that are genuine and authentic, and let's try to find some common ground. I mean, here in the States anyway, we seem to have a racial thing that's really boiling up, And I've recently come across some conversations that would seem to indicate that race is not the primary thing that's smoldering. It's something else. So what do you guys think? What else should we talk about? Should we talk about, I should say.
I'd say that I mean, it sounds silly, but I think that we need to have a conversation about conversations and really understanding the intent behind why people do the things they do, because it's very easy to believe that someone is doing something that hurts you to hurt you. And in the reality, most people do things that benefit them. And if it happens to hurt someone or benefit someone, that's just an unintended consequence of the actions that they're taking. And the more, I think, a morality is pretty subjective, you know, for just existence, I think. But I think that if people begin to understand that the reason that people do anything has a reason, it's not to, I don't know, does any of this making sense at all?
So it seemed like you began somewhere and then there was somewhere else and I didn't see the jump. So you
Okay.
started with, it's important to have a conversation about conversation. That was the first chunk.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So yeah, I think I think we need to have a conversation about having conversations. And I think that the result of that should be that more people realize that people do not do things to hurt someone else. I think everyone has a reason for every action that they take. It may be a misguided reason. It may be a very weak reason. It may be a pretty morally poor reason to do something, but there is a reason behind it. And I think that,
and we won't
sorry,
get the
go ahead.
reason, and we won't learn the reason unless we converse. That's sort of the connection I'm seeing.
Not really.
Okay.
I think that I'm struggling like how to put it, because it's something that I've thought about, but I don't think I've really ever talked about it much. This is kind of something that happens in the book that I'm writing right now. But of course, I don't want to talk about it too explicitly. So,
You mind if I jump in a little bit?
yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
So I think one of the points that you brushed on a little bit was when people say something or do something that is hurtful to another person. And so what is their motive there? And I think your point is that their motive is almost always self-centered. They're doing it for their own reason, to benefit themselves or something like that. And if it hurts someone else, it's sort of like an unintended consequence. And I think that's very, very true. You know, I've said things that were hurtful before to other people, and I had no intention of hurting them or trying to bash them. I was just kind of stating my worldview, and it ended up hurting or offending other people. And so I really resonate with that. And so I think whenever we see or experience these hurtful episodes, maybe it'd be okay to kind of take a little step back and say, well, was that person really intending to hurt this other, or me, or this other person, or was it just a poor choice of words and they're just stumbling trying to express their thoughts and it came out awkward or odd or even hurtful, but they didn't mean to be hurtful. I think that's part of what you're trying to say there. And I think if we can get our conversations to acknowledge and understand that phenomenon, then we can maybe move our conversations forward a little better without people being hurt and offended and then checking out of the conversation because they got beat up a little bit, when it wasn't intended.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And I think that it goes beyond just emotionally too. I mean, one of like the classic examples is a lion doesn't kill a zebra because it hates zebra and it wants to kill them. It attacks a zebra to eat. It kills a zebra to survive. In the same way that the zebra eats grass and plants, not because it hates plants and just wants to chew them up and eat them. It eats them because it's hungry. And like if you boil down a lot of different decisions, I think any decision that anyone's made that's hurt another person, there's always a reason behind it, and it's very easy to think that the reason is because I think it's very easy to misunderstand what that reason is. Why does why does Trump want to build a wall across the southern border of the United States to keep out immigrants? Well, why does he want to do that? Some people genuinely believe it is because he hates immigrants and he does not like people that are Mexican. And there's a lot of different reasons. And a lot of other people believe that it is because he wants to help strengthen the economy and he wants to protect US citizens. And it's not anything against people from Mexico. It's because of all of these other reasons. And it could be a blend of those two, or it could be an entirely different reason. It's very, very hard to know. But based on where you're standing, it's much easier to believe one of those reasons over the other. But I think it's important to realize that there's a reason behind it. Like, he's not just making the decision to only hurt people. I think he's making it for other reasons as well. He may actually genuinely like to hurt people. I don't think so. I would like to believe that he doesn't, but that may be part of it. I don't know. It's really, really hard to say, but there's always a reason behind actions. I think that's something that people should approach a conversation with.
Okay.
Yeah, there's reasons behind actions, and the reasons can be multiple reasons and maybe not even agree with each other. For example, does Trump hate Mexicans? Maybe yes or no. Does he really love Americans? Well, yes, maybe yes, no. And so those can both have a yes or no answer at the same time and appear to be contradictory and yet all be part of the true situation in his mind anyway. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so I still don't quite see I sort of like, I feel it, but
Mm-hmm.
what exactly is the connection between the idea that people's motives are complex and multifaceted in some way? We can't just
Yeah.
assume we know them. And how does that connect to sort of the quality of conversations? Yeah.
I think that kind of like I was talking about before, of like finding that common ground is if you have two people on different sides of the gun debate, um, the core, like someone that is very, very pro-gun may see a person lobbying for very, very strict gun control, and they think it's very easy to assume that their reason for fighting for tighter gun restrictions is to take their guns away, when in reality, their desire for stricter gun control is to save lives and bring violence down, and to not have people die because firearms got into the wrong hands. And I think that by having conversations like this, honestly, like the ones that we're having, and talking about really the intent, and just talking about talking, and realizing that let's establish this common ground first, it will be much easier to see and understand that even if I thought your reason was this for wanting tighter gun control, I see now that your reason for it is not to take away my guns, it is to save lives. And that is something that we can both agree on. We both want less gun violence in the United States.
Okay, so if I can just reflect that, you're saying that
Yeah.
when we get more intentional about conversations, or you could also say start talking about conversations,
Yeah.
that should naturally lead to us getting a way better view of each other's goals and not projecting something on each other.
Yes. Yeah, that's it.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Cool.
Yeah, I think if we're more intentional about our conversations, we'll realize that people's intent is not nefarious.
Yeah. There's not a
right
bunch
out
of
the gate.
mustachio twirling villains all over the place trying to.
Yeah, I'm not like, ooh, I will take his gun control away.
How
like,
can I hurt people's day? Yes.
Yeah. It's not how many guns can I take away from law-abiding citizens. It's how much can I reduce gun violence.
Yeah.
That's, and I think that if we talk about talking and realize that there should be a goal to our conversations, we should try and find that common ground and solve the common issue, because oftentimes people have issues with the same things. Like, there's this huge homelessness epidemic in California, and there are people that immediately agree on that, but then start fighting about how, and they don't talk about why it should be fixed and the merits and downfalls of those ideas. They just they fight about it instead
It's
of
like it's like we
trying.
run too fast into the conversation.
Yeah. Hmm.
Mhm.
Yeah. It's so easy to find uncommon ground.
Yeah.
It's so easy, because if you have two totally smooth plates and you're rubbing them against each other, but each one has a little burr, those are the parts that are going to rub. You're not
Mhm.
going to get good contact until those burrs are worn out. So I think people attack those first instead of saying, let's shift these plates so the burrs aren't touching, and then like establish a really good point of contact here and then move forward.
Mm. Yeah.
Well, I think that might actually be kind of an outgrowth of problem solving. If we're trying to build something or do something, all the parts that are working well, we can just shove those off to the side. No need to discuss those at all. Let's focus on what's
Mm.
not working.
Right.
And in a conversation or any kind of ideological discussion, well, all of a sudden, bam, you're banging heads against the hot points. And it'd be good to maybe step back a little bit and say, before we get to the hot points, let's agree on some common ground first. Let's talk about the things that are working,
Yeah.
in the problem
Yeah.
solving. Let's talk about what's working really well
Yeah.
first, and enjoy some conversation and some time with each other before we start docking heads on the hot points. So
Yeah. I
maybe in
think that's,
conversations, it'd just be good to just kind of ease in and actually spend some time acknowledging the common ground.
Yeah.
Put in some time, might as well say waste some time
Mm.
acknowledging common ground. I think that's a good thing. That's not a waste of time at all.
Yeah.
yeah, I think that's a really good way to say it, because you're not saying we're not going to get to the hot points, but you say, before we get to the hot points,
Yeah,
let's find some common ground.
Let's take care of
Let's
the
agree on some
conversation.
stuff. Yeah, let's take stock of what we agree on, and then let's discuss how to address that agreement,
yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's the only way we're going to, because it seems like the division is just increasing. The only way we're going to get bridge that gap is to learn how to. It's going to be hard. And I guess what I wanted to say while you were just talking, Dad, is like it's kind of unnatural for humans to not focus on the problems. I think it's kind of our natural state to be dissatisfied and to want to fix things and think, how can I make this better? And so maybe that's and that's what you were, I think, saying. Like when we get into a conversations, it's easy to just immediately focus on where we disagree and try to work that out, assuming that we're going to be perfectly rational and our emotions aren't going to get involved. But in reality, um, that's not really how it works. And so it's a little bit unnatural, I think, and maybe a skill we have to practice to ease into conversations, hold ourselves back from jumping to the hot points, and really take care of the conversation.
Yeah.
Well, that feels like a good conclusion to me. Yeah. Any other thoughts from you guys?
Well, yeah, just a short one, and that is, I've been following some of the members of the intellectual dark web,
Oh, yeah.
IDW. Brett Weinstein and his brother Eric,
Have
and
you
some
heard
of
of
the
this
others.
group, Kyle?
Yeah. Hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that was the I think email kind of thread that started
Oh,
the
that's
whole
right. That's right.
conversation about it. Yeah, about the IDW.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so what I want to say about that is that these guys are, I think, just jumping out there and demonstrating authentic conversation and doing it on topics that are, timely and controversial and all that sort of stuff. So
Mhm.
Brett, I think, is doing a great, and his brother both, but Brett just had a roundtable of, I think, 7 or 8 or 9, uh, you know, people of color, let's say Black people, that he wanted to discuss this racial problem with and try to get to the root causes.
Mm.
And I think that it was a great example of having that kind of a conversation. Now, with that said, I think that conversation was, uh, I guess, less effective than having just 1 or 2 people.
Yeah.
I think that format of having 8 or 9 people, well, that was, I just don't think it was very conducive to really putting the conversation forward.
Yeah.
But that's just my own take on that. But anyway, but I think what they are doing is they're demonstrating how to have these conversations, and I think that's fantastic.
Yeah.
Yeah. The one thing that I have found that I don't really care for folks from the IDW that I've seen, at least Brett and Eric Weinstein specifically, is that it does seem like um, my kind of issue, I guess, with them is the whole intent thing, and it seems like they will assume a group or a person's intent um, pretty steadfastly and base a lot of their arguments around that, which I think that the conversations that they are having are well intentioned, but I think that there are different aspects of how they approach disagreements uh, is not conducive to the conversation as a whole.
Yeah, and I
And
want to.
I I'm sorry, I said I may be like, focusing in on a point that I hold issue with a little bit too, intently and focusing in on that too much. But yeah, I think that it might be a me problem as well, at least to some degree. But it does seem like they will focus in on a specific belief about a specific argument and really focus on that, I think, a little too intently.
Hmm. I I also am not. I was more of a fan of the IDW when it first came out, and this is maybe a whole other discussion. But I think maybe part of what happened is that they rose to prominence. They started to identify with their positions, and I think that kind of locked them in a way. I really do still appreciate Brett and Eric Weinstein's thoughts, but I still get the feeling that now they're in a position where their audience expects certain things. There's this idea of audience capture that content creators will talk about, like YouTube creators. Audience capture is when your audience, you have a good enough feel for what your audience expects that expectation captures you. And now you're delivering to your audience. So I really appreciate Brett and Eric, but I know that I'm one of the audience. That for example, I'm extremely suspicious of the woke left stuff. I'm very, very against that. But um, but there is, I guess, I just want to sort of say that I don't really see the IDW as being the champions that I first saw them as. Especially, like, a great example is Sam Harris. He's a brilliant enough thinker, but it just feels like he's so locked into his identity as whatever it is that he does that it's like he's blind to other opinions and he doesn't even know that he's blind to them. And so, yeah, I don't know. Maybe that's just a bit of a tangent on the IDW. I think they played a good role, but I don't really have a lot of hopes for them playing the role that I thought they would play back when they first kind of came into existence. That word, anyway.
Well, I can jump in a little. I think of the two, of course, they're brothers. I think that, and it's just an impression. I probably can't even point to anything hard on this, but it's my impression that Brett is a little softer on his stance and Eric is a little harder.
Mm-hmm.
And I think Brett does a better job of trying to find out what the other person thinks. And Eric, I think, is a little bit more on he's trying to drive his points into the conversation.
Yeah.
And get people to respond to his points. And probably the I think the most the biggest example of that was when he interviewed Jocko Wilkins, I think is the guy's name. He's a former Navy SEAL, and now he does his lecture tours on the dichotomy of leadership. And so Eric had him on, and I think Eric was really trying to drive some points on the military culture and trying to get Jocko to respond to that in kind of a directed way. And I think Brett would have been quite a bit more softer on that to just let Jocko tell his story. I don't know. And then one of the other people that was included in that, the intellectual dark web was Joe Rogan. And I think in that, of course, and I love Joe Rogan's, I mean, I look at his stuff quite a lot. And I think that where I think I want to sort of say fails his audience, and that's maybe too strong of a word, but he goes into those, and he's open about this. He says, look, I just want to sit down with this person and have a conversation. Mm-hmm. And that's his stated aim. He's not trying to overanalyze his program or even whatever. But I think he fails a little bit in trying to put himself into the conversation as much as he does. And I wish in some cases he would just kind of calm down a little bit and let his guest deliver the story they came to deliver, and Joe wants to jump in and have his, experiences of whatever that, and well, okay, that's fine, Joe, but we've heard your stories before. We know where you're going to come at. We know what you're going to say. It's kind of the same old thing as Joe Rogan. And what I'm here for is to hear that other person. So
I've gotten a little tired of Joe Rogan, and it's not because I don't like him, but it's like I'm kind of watching the same thing again. And it wouldn't be the case if he was maybe talking, 20% rather than maybe 50 or maybe even 60%. So
yeah, I think it would be interesting to have a show like that where they had kind of a host of interviewers that all had different backgrounds. That kind of, maybe sometimes they do very intentionally align with the person that they are going to interview, and sometimes they very intentionally do not align with that person. I think that would be an interesting thing. Like when you're interviewing an athlete, it would be nice to have someone with more athletic knowledge so they can speak more directly to certain points and not have so much explained to them. And then when you're dealing with like a political scientist, maybe it would be good to have someone that's not so heavily invested in political science in general, so that they can break it down a little bit more. I think that would be an interesting kind of format.
Yeah.
So you have multiple interviewers and one guest. Is that kind of what you're saying, Kyle?
Not one guest every single time, but have multiple interviewers in that kind of Joe Rogan format, so that when you get a guest, you can kind of pick of 7 or 8 different interviewers that you have ready to do interviews. Then you'll be able to pick one that kind of fits with that person, and then that almost kind of establishes the intent. Like maybe one person is very, very inquisitive and will ask simple questions and then sit back and let someone explain it, whereas one is pretty, and you're like very much a part of the conversation, and much like Joe Rogan talks maybe 50 or 60% of the time, but it helps.
And do you mean like in one episode you'd have only one interviewer, or they'd all sort of be involved at the same time?
I don't know.
Yeah, because
my initial thought would be a full interview with one person, but it would be interesting to go, okay, we're gonna break, and then we're gonna come in with Joe Smelly or something like that, and he'll talk about his he'll carry on the second half of the interview or something like that.
Yeah,
I do like the idea of having multiple interviewers with let's say radically different takes on the subject. So if you're interviewing a professional athlete, it would be nice to have another person that's really into the athletic scene to ask those really deep, nuanced questions. And then another interviewer to saying, wait, what do you mean? You're talking about what does offsides even mean? And for the common listener to say, oh, thank you for that, because man, I didn't know what the hell they were talking about. So I think it would be good to have sort of a group of interview. Sometimes that your job interview process sometimes goes to the level of you're interviewing in front of 3 questioners. Or like you're defending your thesis for your PhD. You have to defend it against a panel of 3 people who are going to try to tear you down. And so that I think the multiple questioner could be a really powerful way to run one of those shows. Yeah, that's a good idea.
Yeah, and even if it's because Joe Rogan can talk about his own thing, but if there was Joe Rogan and someone else that was always on the show, at least they'd be talking, and there's kind of more unpredictability in a conversation between 2 people, even if it's the same 2 people.
Yeah.
So that could be interesting. You could have maybe you could have like a podcast where there's 2 or 3 or 4 interviewers. They're always the same. And then there's 1 or 2 guests that show up every time. And the focus is more on the guests, and maybe some, that probably naturally some of the interviewers wouldn't speak much in some episodes and would speak more in others. And actually on a Zoom call, that might work really well, because you don't need to worry about the room configuration. And if one interviewer literally never says anything the whole episode, well, he just kind of wasn't there. That's fine. And I really also like how it ties into this kind of conversation I'm trying to cultivate here too, because you could take us 3, we 3 could be the interviewers, and then every week for, you know, argument's sake, we could bring in 2 other people and that would be a show.
Yeah. It would be interesting too if you, for the different interviewers, had people with pretty radically different viewpoints. You know, one person that is very solidly like self-identified as like a centrist, and they're like, you know, I take each issue as it is, and then someone that is fairly right, and then someone that's fairly left, and then, you know, for political issues is like the easiest thing to do. But if it was more of like a laid back type of interview style, I think just people of different backgrounds, you know, like athletes or writers or engineers or a programmer, you know, everyone's going to have different approaches to different problems.
Yeah. And, you know, the line between interviewer and interviewee kind of blurs as well too, because maybe one interviewer doesn't show up half the time. So is he an interviewer or is he an interviewee? Yeah. And a lot of people are, I mean, I'm enjoying, and I'm seeing other people sort of do these chats, you know, especially with the lockdown stuff. And now everyone knows how to use Zoom. And this is becoming an interesting piece of a type of content, you know, just conversation between people. So, yeah. Well, I'm going to stop recording because I'm actually getting really tired. It's 8:30, but I didn't get much sleep. So thank you guys for the chat. Yeah, it was cool.